I sat on the wooden floor where the paint had worn thin, tracing my finger along a small scar in the boards that had been there longer than I could remember. The house was almost empty now, only the rocking chair left by the window, moving faintly when the draft slipped in. The air felt too still, like it was holding its breath with me. My chest tightened as the ticking of the wall clock grew louder each second, pushing me further away from the life I once guarded inside these walls. I had lived here after my marriage collapsed, clinging to this place as proof that I still belonged somewhere. Now it was gone, signed away with a trembling hand. The silence carried more weight than words ever could. I pressed my palm to the floor as if I could anchor myself to what was already lost. In the corner, light spilled weakly through the curtain, pale and unwelcoming. I tried to imagine mornings without this space, but the thought slipped away before it could form. My voice never rose, but inside me, a question repeated stubborn and sharp. How could a home become the weapon that undid me? My parents always spoke about family as if it were a currency. Every decision had to yield something: a reputation, a favor, a step upward. I grew up knowing that my sister was the one they had chosen to invest in. She was the promise of their future, the daughter who carried their ambitions with the grace of someone who never had to question her place. I, on the other hand, was expected to make room. I learned early to tuck away my wants so she could shine. After my marriage fell apart, this small house became my one quiet proof that I existed beyond their ledger. I painted the kitchen walls myself, pale yellow to soften the mornings. I planted a small maple tree in the yard, watching its leaves turn crimson each fall. None of it was grand, but it was mine, and that mattered. When my parents first suggested I sell the house to my sister, they spoke as though they were offering me a chance at nobility. "It's not giving up," my mother said, her eyes steady. "It's contributing." My father added that my sister's future as a wife, a mother, and a professional demanded stability, and what better foundation than these very walls? They promised me it would bind the family closer. I tried to listen without trembling, telling myself they only wanted the best for all of us. Still, the request clung like frost on glass. I walked through the rooms that night, running my hands across the surfaces. I thought of how I had cried in the bedroom corner when I realized my husband wasn't coming back. I remembered the nights I sat by the window, the rain tapping gently, as if to remind me I was still alive. Could I give that up? They pressed me with reminders of everything they had done, the years of shelter, the endless sacrifices. My sister avoided my eyes, her silence heavy with expectation. I told myself that maybe by yielding, once more peace would follow. Maybe they would finally see me as more than a shadow, as someone who chose family over pride. The word hope felt fragile on my tongue, yet I clung to it. I wanted to believe this choice might not erase me completely. In my heart, I whispered a bargain. If I gave them this house, would they at last let me keep something of myself? The family meeting was held at my parents' dining table, the same table where birthdays and holidays had once been celebrated with laughter. Now the surface gleamed under the chandelier, polished to a shine that felt cold. My father laid out papers, charts, and figures as though we were in a boardroom instead of a home. He spoke of mortgages, investments, and long-term gains. My mother nodded along her hands, folded neatly, her voice calm but sharp whenever she glanced my way. My sister sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her lips pressed into a polite smile. I waited for her to say something, anything that might ease the heaviness pressing down on me. But she only looked at the table, as though her silence was a kind of innocence. When I finally spoke, my words barely carried across the room. This house is all I have left. My voice trembled, not from anger, but from the weight of being unheard for so long. My father didn't even pause. He adjusted his glasses, circled a number on the page, and reminded me that sometimes sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. My mother added that I had always been resilient, that I would find a way. The room fell into a rhythm of their voices, rising and falling like a tide that drowned out my own. I sat back, remembering another time I had been asked to step aside. I was 17 then, holding an acceptance letter to a college 3 states away. My parents convinced me to give up the scholarship so the family could afford my sister's music program. They told me I would have other chances. I never did. Another memory surfaced, a job I loved offered to me after months of proving myself. I turned it down because my mother said my sister needed me close to help with her newborn. Each time I told myself it was temporary, that they would see my sacrifices for what they were. Yet each time I slipped further into the role of the invisible daughter. Sitting at that table now, I realized nothing had changed. My sister's smile grew brighter when my father concluded his speech, as if the decision had already been made. I stared at the papers, the inked lines blurring, until they were only shadows. The first sting of betrayal was not in their words, but in the silence that followed, a silence that told me my voice had no place there. The sense of being erased settled deeper than any wound I could touch. The room where the papers were signed smelled faintly of ink and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to government buildings and offices where decisions were final. A clerk guided us through the process, her expression detached, as though she had seen countless families make choices they could never take back. I sat across the polished desk, my hands folded too tightly in my lap, while my father tapped the pen against the table, as if impatient for me to move faster. My mother watched me with narrowed eyes, not unkind, but heavy with expectation, like a teacher waiting for a reluctant student. My sister was radiant, dressed as though she were attending a celebration instead of a transfer of ownership. Her nails were painted a deep crimson that caught the light when she reached for the pen. She did not look at me, not once, as she leaned forward to sign her name. The sound of her pen scratching across the page echoed louder than it should have. When it was my turn, the paper blurred. My name had never looked so small, crammed into a line that demanded I let go. I hesitated, staring at the letters at the house number typed neatly in black. This place had carried my breath in every corner, my laughter when I was still capable of it, my tears when no one else would listen. Signing that line felt like cutting my own voice out of history. My father cleared his throat. My mother tilted her head ever so slightly, the kind of gesture that told me everything had already been decided. I signed. The pen shook in my hand, but the ink did not hesitate. The papers were stacked, stamped, sealed. My sister's smile widened as though a crown had been placed upon her head. My parents exchanged a look of pride, their hands brushing like conspirators who had succeeded in their plan. I walked out into the daylight, and the world felt heavier, as though the air itself was pressing down on me. In the car, I sat still for a long time before turning the key. The city moved outside my window, but I was frozen. Every red light reflected back my own hollow eyes. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, then loosened my hold, realizing that nothing I held now would stay. That night, I returned to the house one last time. It no longer belonged to me, but the key still fit. I opened the door quietly, like a guest sneaking into a place I should not enter. The room smelled familiar, yet foreign. I moved from space to space, my footsteps echoing on floors that no longer claimed me. In the kitchen, I touched the wall where the yellow paint had chipped slightly, remembering the day I rolled the color on with my own hands, humming softly to keep myself company. I leaned against the counter where I had once cried into a cold cup of coffee, convincing myself that loneliness was just another season. Upstairs, I paused at the bedroom door. The shadows curled in the corners, and the air carried the memory of nights when I lay awake listening to the rain. The roof had always leaked in one spot, a steady drip that forced me to place a pot under it, the sound like a heartbeat in the silence. I left it unfixed, almost grateful for the reminder that the house was alive with me. I stood there breathing deeply, letting every fragment of memory press against me at once. It was not just wood and brick I was losing, it was proof that I had endured, that I had existed beyond what they demanded of me. When I finally stepped outside the maple tree I had planted waved slightly in the breeze. Its leaves had begun to turn crimson edges, catching the fading light. I reached out and touched the bark rough and solid under my palm. The tree had roots now deep in the soil. It would not be moved by signatures or stamps. I envied it. Days passed, and the weight did not lift. I woke in the small apartment I had rented on the edge of town, but I felt like a ghost displaced from her body. The walls were blank, the air too quiet. I tried to cook a simple meal, but ended up staring at the pot until the water boiled over. I carried the silence with me wherever I went, hearing it louder than any sound. At work, colleagues smiled politely, unaware that I was unraveling behind my eyes. In the grocery store, I watched other families move through the aisles, their laughter echoing while I pushed an empty cart. Each night, I returned to the apartment, and each night, I closed my eyes, wishing for the familiar creak of the old floorboards. The pain grew sharper when my parents called to remind me of the upcoming dinner. They wanted to celebrate my sister's new chapter. Their voices carried no trace of hesitation, no awareness of what they had asked me to surrender. My mother's tone was bright, my father's steady, and my sister's laughter chimed faintly in the background. I agreed to come, though the words stuck in my throat. On the day of the gathering, I dressed simply, slipping into a dark dress that hung loose at the shoulders. I did not bother with jewelry or bright colors. The drive to the house felt endless. When I pulled up the side of my home, her home knocked the air out of me. Balloons tied to the mailbox bobbed in the wind. Cars lined the street. Through the windows, I saw people moving inside, glasses raised, voices rising in cheer. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring at the door I had walked through thousands of times. My hand twitched toward my pocket where the key still rested, though it no longer meant anything. Stepping inside, I was swallowed by warmth and noise. Relatives crowded the rooms, praising my sister, congratulating my parents. No one looked at me. I drifted among them like a shadow, listening to their words. "She's so responsible," someone said. "A home is the best foundation." I wanted to laugh, to shout, but my voice remained buried. I walked toward the staircase, letting my hand trail the banister I had polished so many times. Upstairs, the rooms looked altered. My sister had already changed things, new curtains, new rugs, photos of her life arranged carefully. It was as if my presence had been scrubbed away. In the corner of what was once my bedroom, the pot I had used for the leaking roof was gone. The silence was too clean, stripped of memory. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of loss settle deeper. By the time I returned downstairs, my sister was in the center of the room, her arm around a man I did not know. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, his smile rehearsed. When he introduced himself as her CEO, the air shifted. I caught the glint of papers in his hand, but no one else seemed to notice. My parents hovered nearby, their faces flushed with pride. They believed they had secured everything. Yet as I stood there, invisible among their joy, I felt a different truth stirring beneath the surface. Something had already been set in motion, something none of them expected. I could not yet name it, but I sensed it waiting like a storm hidden behind the horizon. I stayed silent, watching my heart heavy but alert. Every detail of that night pressed into me: the scent of champagne, the sound of laughter, the sight of my parents shining with certainty. They thought the story had ended. But deep down, I knew it had only just begun. The night of the celebration began with the sharp pop of corks and the clinking of glasses. My parents moved through the crowd as if they were hosts of a grand ball, their eyes glowing with pride. They had dressed in their finest clothes, my mother in a shimmering dress that reflected every light, my father in a suit that made him stand straighter than usual. My sister basked in their admiration, her smile radiant, her arm looped around the tall man she introduced as her CEO. His presence unsettled me, though I couldn't yet say why. He was polite, charming even, but his eyes were calculating, scanning the room as though measuring its worth. I stood near the wall, half hidden by the shadows, my fingers gripping the stem of a glass I never raised to my lips. The noise pressed against me, laughter and chatter folding into one another until it felt like the walls themselves might burst. The man cleared his throat, and the room quieted almost instantly. My sister beamed, her hand tightening on his arm, as if to anchor herself to his power. He began to speak with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. His voice was smooth, deliberate, each word placed with care. This home, he announced, is more than a gift. It is a cornerstone for growth, for expansion, for something larger than any one family. My mother clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with tears. My father nodded, proud and expectant. They thought he was offering a toast to their daughter's new chapter, but his next words sliced through the room like glass shattering on stone. As of this week, this property is under the management of our company. A merger has been finalized. This home, along with its value, is now part of our enterprise. Silence fell. For a moment, it was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. My mother's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. My father's face drained of color. My sister's grip on the man's arm tightened, her nails digging into his sleeve. Gasps rippled through the guests' murmurs, rising like a tide. My parents turned to me as if the truth must somehow be my fault, but I only stood still, the glass trembling in my hand. My mother's voice cracked first. "What are you saying?" she demanded, her tone sharp-edged with disbelief. "This is our daughter's home. It belongs to her." The man did not flinch. "It did, but she chose to partner with us. The papers were signed. Legally, it is ours now." My father's voice thundered louder than I had ever heard it. "You tricked us. This was supposed to secure her future." The CEO's smile did not waver. "It has secured her future. Only now her future is tied to something larger, something beyond these walls." My sister's face crumpled, caught between pride and panic. She tried to speak, but her words stumbled out half-formed. The room erupted into chaos. Voices raised accusations, flung relatives whispering in disbelief. My parents shouted their shrieks, filling the house until they echoed in my bones. They had come expecting triumph and found betrayal instead. I stood apart, watching the scene unfold, my chest tightening, not with shock, but with a strange clarity. For years, I had been the one sacrificed, the one expected to yield for the sake of others' dreams. I had signed away my home because their voices drowned mine out. Yet now, the very voices that silenced me were being silenced in turn. Their power crumbled before my eyes, stripped away by the very alliance they had pushed me to accept. My mother wept openly, clutching at my father's arm. He paced the floor like a trapped animal, his face twisted with fury. My sister whispered frantic excuses to anyone who would listen, insisting she had not known the full extent of the deal. But the guests were already pulling back their faces hard, their judgments sharp. The celebration had turned into a spectacle of ruin. I set my glass down on the nearest table, the stem clicking softly against the wood. My hands no longer trembled. I watched them flail, watched the fortress of certainty they had built collapse, brick by brick. And in that collapse, I felt something inside me shift. For the first time, I was not the one shrinking under the weight of their expectations. I was not the one apologizing, yielding, or breaking. Their shrieks filled the house, but I stood in silence, steady and unshaken. The truth had surfaced without my voice, yet it vindicated me all the same. I did not need to lift a hand or raise my voice. The home they prized above my worth had turned against them. And in that chaos, in their unraveling, I felt a quiet power take root in me. It was not vengeance. It was not joy in their suffering. It was the simple, undeniable knowledge that I was free from their grasp. When the shouting finally subsided, I stepped forward. My parents looked at me as though I were the culprit, the reason their grand design had unraveled. My mother's eyes were red, her hands shaking. My father's jaw clenched, his face still flushed with anger. For years, I would have rushed to calm them, to explain myself, to shoulder blame that was never mine. But that night, I did not move to comfort them. I stood still, my voice steady, when I spoke. "You asked me to give up this house," I said. "You told me it would be for the good of the family, and I did it even though it broke me. Now you see the truth. Your plans never included me, only what I could give." My words did not rise in anger. They fell into the room like stones sinking into water, quiet but unyielding. My sister tried to reach for me, her voice trembling. "I didn't know it would end this way. I thought it was just security." I shook my head. "You knew enough. You knew I was being erased. You let it happen." She lowered her eyes, unable to meet mine. My father began to speak again, but I lifted my hand, stopping him for the first time in my life. The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. "I will not be the sacrifice anymore," I told them. "I will not give away the last of myself to hold this family together." My chest loosened as I said it, a weight falling away that I hadn't realized I still carried. They stood, frozen mouths half open, as if my refusal was a language they could not understand. I turned, moving toward the door. The noise behind me swelled again, but I did not look back. Outside, the night air wrapped around me, cool and unbroken by shouts. The street was quiet, lined with shadows of trees swaying gently. For the first time in years, my steps felt entirely my own. I walked away from the house with nothing in my hands, but everything I needed was inside me. It was not revenge that carried me forward. It was the dignity of finally choosing myself. The morning after I left the house, I woke in my small apartment to the thin light of dawn slipping through the blinds. The silence was different here. It wasn't the silence of absence, heavy with loss. It was a softer kind, like the pause between heartbeats. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also something unfamiliar, an ease I hadn't known in years. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, yet nothing pressed against me. No voices waiting to correct me. No expectations lingering like a shadow. I made coffee in the chipped pot I had bought secondhand, the smell filling the air with comfort. I carried the mug to the window, holding it between both hands, as though it were a steadying anchor. Outside, the street was quiet, a boy riding his bike down the sidewalk, a neighbor waving absently as she left for work. It was ordinary, almost painfully so, and yet I felt my chest lift with relief. I had nothing left to lose, and that realization brought a freedom I could not have imagined. I thought of my parents' faces twisted in disbelief as their plans unraveled. I thought of my sister's eyes wide with shame, her CEO standing beside her, like a reminder that nothing was truly hers. For the first time, their choices did not define me. I was no longer the daughter expected to yield, the sister expected to hand over her life in silence. I was simply myself, sitting in a small room with sunlight spilling across the floor. Later, I walked to the park a few blocks away. The trees bent gently in the wind, their leaves whispering against each other. I sat on a bench and watched strangers move past, their conversations floating in fragments. I wasn't part of their stories, and that felt right. I had space now, space to breathe, space to consider what I wanted without being told who I should become. I let the stillness sink into me. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was peace. I realized that what I had lost was not the house itself. It was the illusion that holding on to it would ever win me my family's love. That illusion had fallen away, leaving me bare, but also unburdened. My heart whispered a new truth. Love given freely cannot be demanded, and peace cannot be bartered. As the sun rose higher, I closed my eyes, letting the warmth touch my skin. For the first time in years, I wasn't replaying old arguments or rehearsing words I might never say. I was simply present. The maple tree I had planted still stood in the yard of a house that was no longer mine, but its roots belonged to the earth, not to a name on paper. And so did I. I belonged to myself now. In the weeks that followed, I began to trace the outlines of a new life. At first, it felt strange waking each day without the constant hum of my parents' demands or my sister's silent expectations pressing against me. The emptiness of my apartment was stark, but I started to see it differently. Each bare wall was a promise that nothing here had been taken from me. Each quiet morning was mine alone to shape. I filled the space slowly, not with expensive furniture or photographs meant to prove something, but with small, honest comforts. A worn rug I found at a thrift store. A lamp with a soft glow that made evenings gentler. A set of dishes in mismatched colors that somehow felt truer than anything polished. These things were simple, but they were chosen by me for me. Healing did not arrive like a sudden wave. It came quietly in fragments. It was in the laughter of a coworker who invited me out for lunch, reminding me that friendship could exist without debt. It was in the calm of walking through the park, my steps unhurried, no one waiting to redirect me. It was in the quiet joy of cooking a meal just for myself and sitting down to eat without apology. For so long, I had been told that sacrifice was the price of belonging. Now I understood that belonging could not be purchased at the cost of my own self. The lesson came sharp at first, but over time it softened into clarity. Family may have blood, but it does not always have love. Love, the kind that heals, is not earned through surrender. It is nurtured through presence, through respect, through freedom. My parents and my sister had not given me that, so I began to give it to myself. One evening, I lit a candle and sat at the table with my journal open. The pen moved slowly, not to document pain, but to mark possibility. I wrote about dreams I had once silenced, places I wanted to see, things I wanted to try. None of them depended on permission. They were mine alone, waiting for me to claim. I thought of others, who might know the same kind of erasure women who had been told their lives were less important, their voices too soft, their sacrifices expected. I wanted to tell them you do not have to keep handing yourself away. You can step back, you can choose yourself, and you can still stand with dignity. That is what I carry now, not anger, not revenge, but freedom. A freedom rooted in the simple act of saying no more. If you have ever lost yourself trying to be enough for others, I hope you find that freedom too. Let it be quiet. Let it be steady. And let it guide you back to yourself. I close my eyes now, and I feel it, not a house, not approval, but the quiet certainty that I am finally home.